Tallapoosa County, Alabama, August 1856. The first time her name entered a ledger, it was written with a hesitation that bled through the ink. Hester, very tall, of unusual strength, 22. By the time the county clerk turned the page, the rumor had outrun the handwriting. People said 6 men once tried to hold her down at the river bend and failed. People said iron couldn't do what their hands could not. People said she never raised her voice. And that was what made them afraid. Hester worked on the Washburn plantation, a spread of cotton and lowland swamp, where the air in late summer felt like wet cloth. She stood 7 feet by guess and doorframe, her back a wall, her forearms rope-thick from years of lifting what other arms dropped. The quarters called her chain breaker, not because she carried iron in her hands, but because she wore it like a bracelet, and then did not, because locks seemed to tire in her presence, and hinges remembered how to open. Before all that, before the stories thickened and gathered into legend, there was a field, a heat shimmer, and a girl who refused to give away the sound in her throat. Hester barely spoke. When she did, it was to answer roll or to calm a crying child. Silence around her was not absence. It was a structure. It kept the quarters cool when the house burned hot with orders. The Washburn books record a season of shortage in 56. 2 gins down, 1 overseer drunk. A loan called in by a banker who prayed as often as he calculated. The planter, Josiah Washburn, had learned to keep his wealth on paper and his temper in his hands. He called it discipline. Others called it a storm that never moved on. What happened by the river bend began with a rumor and a dare. A padlock vanished from the storehouse. A chain from the mule shed was found coiled like a sleeping snake under a pine. The overseer, Tully Pike, said an example must be made. Iron answers iron. He and 5 men walked the fence line until they found Hester returning from the creek with a barrel on her shoulder that would have required 2 men to carry together. "Put it down," Pike said. She didn't. He reached for the barrel. Hester looked past him at the river and kept walking. That was the story told in the quarters. What happened next fractured into a dozen versions. In one, Pike grabbed her wrist, and the chain he carried slipped and clanged against rock like a church bell that had forgotten why it was ringing. In another, one of the men tripped, the barrel fell, and they called it defiance. The only part that remained the same across tellings was this: 6 men tried to make Hester small, and the world refused to cooperate. The planter said she had assaulted them. The quarters said the men had assaulted the order of things, believing weight and number could hold down a person who understood how to be more than her body. Either way, Hester ended the day unbound. The men left with bruised pride and wrists, and a story they couldn't stop telling each other at the big house, that iron had not held, that a woman had made them feel like paper, that something larger than leverage had been at work. That night, the cicadas were loud as news. Mothers kept children inside. Men sat on thresholds with their feet in dust, as if feeling for vibrations only the ground could hear. Hester sat near the cookhouse door and watched the sky turn the color of used copper. She placed a short length of chain on the step beside her, a piece she used as a doorweight, and with her thumb pressed one link until it bent enough to catch the light differently. She didn't snap it or twist it into display. She altered it the way a person adjusts a memory to be bearable. What came after ran faster than proof. The men who had tried to restrain her began to disappear from Washburn's employ, not in one night, not all at once, but like fence posts giving way after a flood. One left without pay, another took fever and never recovered, Another broke his collarbone in a fall no one saw. A fourth signed on with a neighbor, then moved west. A fifth was reported to have drowned crossing the creek in the dark. The current returned his hat and kept his name. Tully Pike stayed longest, pale and angry in daylight, careful and quieter at night. He'd stopped carrying the chain. People said it made a noise he could feel in his teeth. By harvest, no one could say precisely what Hester had done or not done. That uncertainty became the story. Some called it justice. Others called it conjure. Hester called it nothing. She returned to her work, lifting, washing, mending, stacking cotton bales with a patience that made the scales look silly. Children watched her with the reverence they saved for storms and midwives. You can measure a legend by the way the county talks around it. Women in the quarters started resting their hands on Hester's forearm when fear grew loud. Men borrowed her silence the way a person borrows a coat that actually fits. In the big house, Washburn forbade her name at table. "That woman," he told a guest from Mobile, "is why discipline matters." The guest nodded, the way guests do, and took his leave sooner than planned. When drought followed flood and the year turned mean, a traveling deacon came through preaching a gospel that sounded like bookkeeping. "God keeps ledger," he said, tapping the Bible. "He knows which link broke first." Hester stood at the back under the live oak, her head above the crowd, and did not move. Afterward, the deacon approached Washburn and suggested a day of Thanksgiving to reassert providence over rumor. Washburn liked rituals that looked like order. He declared a Sabbath for the plantation. No work, extra rations, a hymn sing at dusk. People ate, people sang, people breathed like people again. At the hymn sing, a woman named Dinah Ruth led the line. Her voice walked between notes with an old agility. Hester stood beside the well, hands folded, eyes not on the singer but on the horizon. When the last refrain rose and settled, she stepped forward, lifted the well chain, and let it slip through her hands, link by link, until the bucket touched water. The sound was delicate and unthreatening. Even the children went quiet to hear it. Hester tied off the chain and left it there, uncoiled, shining, ordinary. That was her sermon. If the story ended here, we would have a parable of strength disciplined by mercy. But Alabama doesn't allow easy endings, not in the years before war. Washburn's debts hardened. Pike, stung by his own rumor, gathered a new band of men from a neighboring estate and whispered a plan that sounded like a dare, said in the wrong place. They would escort Hester to the county jail for questioning, make her small on paper if not in person, bind the legend with ink. They chose a moonless night, believing Shadow their ally. The quarters knew before they did. Fear moves faster than bad ideas. When the men came with lanterns muffled and rope coiled under jackets, a line of women stepped from the dark and stood between Hester and the path. 3 across, then 6, then 9, shoulders touching, mouths closed, one of them holding a baby whose sleep would not be interrupted by any man's plan. Hester did not stand behind them. She stood among them like a plumb line. Pike, seeing numbers, set his jaw. "Out of the way," he said, to women who knew more about moving than he did. He lifted the rope like an argument. Someone coughed. Someone prayed. Someone's lantern flickered and reminded everyone that fire is a terrible listener. What happened next is what history does with ambiguity. Washburn's account says the women dispersed, and Hester complied. The women's account says the men lowered their eyes and reconsidered the wisdom of binding what would not be owned. The sheriff's later note says no arrest was made. The men departed peaceably. The children's memory says they saw the rope go slack, and the lantern light shrink as if respect had blown on it, and when they opened their hands the next morning, their palms were clean. By spring of 57, the men from that night had arranged new lives elsewhere. Pike left with the last wagon, his face a knot carved too tight. Hester continued to stack bales and lift barrels and tie up sacks with a neatness that embarrassed men who had made a trade of being careless. Washburn's name kept its shape at the bank, but lost weight within the county. You can tell a man's influence is thinning when he hosts bigger dinners and food tastes of effort. Then the war came and decided which stories would be starred and which would be footnotes. Washburn rode away, certain of triumph. The quarters stayed, certain of other work. Hester became the person people looked for when the wind changed color. She lifted fallen rafters after a storm and carried a preacher with a broken ankle 1/2 mile to the meeting house, because the gospel cannot limp forever. When the blue uniforms finally broke the spine of Alabama, the bureau came with them. Paper, pens, grief with a schedule. The agent who reached Tallapoosa County wrote what he could. Found large woman called Hester, said to have resisted restraint by 6 men. Allegations of chain breaking treated as rumor by whites. Testimony by freed people is consistent. No arrests. Plantation diminished. He underlined consistent twice, as if the act of hearing the same thing from many mouths had weight enough to count. A northern journalist named Samuel Harper followed, the same who would later record The Silent Woman of Lowndes. He had an ear for stories that did not perform for him. He listened to the older women, then to the children who had become fathers, then to the men who had learned to say less around tables that were not theirs. He visited the river bend where the barrel fell, or didn't, where the chain clanged, or didn't, where 6 men learned arithmetic from someone who had not studied numbers. He stood at the well where Hester had let the chain slip through her fingers until everyone remembered that iron can be gentle. Harper never wrote that Hester killed anyone. He wrote that an empire of fear began to mistake its own reflections for ghosts. He wrote that a woman's refusal to accept the shape imposed on her became a mirror in which some men could not meet their own eyes. He titled his piece, Chain Breaker. In small type, beneath the title, a line. A study in power that never learned to listen. By then, Hester had already left the Washburn place. Some said she walked west with a wagon train, carrying 2 children whose mothers could not. Some said she moved north to Tuskegee and worked in a laundry where the iron was her companion, not her warden. Some said she married a quiet man who understood that hush can be holy. Some said she died by the river one evening, her head laid against a stone she had warmed all day, with her hands. The county records list no grave. The quarters list a date, Easter Monday, 1868. The women say they felt the air change that morning, as if a house had finally exhaled after years of holding. The rest is what the South does with memory. A sight becomes a story becomes a sermon becomes a silence you enter, like a room where your grandmother kept her secrets, and her sugar both. Children grew up hearing that 6 men once tried to bind a 7-foot woman, and discovered they had underestimated height. Not the height of her body, though they had done that too, but the height of a life, refusing to be shortened. If you stand by the river bend today, you can still see the place where the road drops, and the water does not apologize. The pine that once hid a coil of chain is taller than the steeple of the church that replaced Washburn's pride. Sometimes a rusted link turns up after a hard rain. Children hold it between finger and thumb, like a coin from a country that doesn't exist anymore. They bring it to their mothers, who say, "Put it back where it belongs. Let the ground keep what it knows. Before we go further, subscribe to History in Chains and tap the bell. We tell the stories people tried to bind with silence, stories that move like rivers beneath the fields, wearing down the stone of forgetting grain by grain. Drop your thoughts below. When does a rumor become a record? When enough mouths agree, or when the ground nods along? By the time the county erected a marker near the bend, Chainbreaker, 1856, the argument had ended not with proof, but with proportion. Hester's name was on the plaque. Washburn's was not. That is a kind of verdict. And if you ask the oldest people what happened to the 6 men, they will shrug and say the living moved on. And so did the dead, and so did Hester. And the chain is where it belongs now, in the well, singing the bucket down, link by link by link. Tallapoosa County, Alabama, April 1865. When the war ended, it didn't end all the way. The armies laid down their rifles, but the soil kept its grudges. In the ruins of the Washburn plantation, the fields lay bare except for a few broken fence posts and a well that still held water. Travelers said that on quiet days, you could hear something like iron shifting deep inside it. A soft ring, as if a chain moved just enough to remember it once mattered. The Bureau agents who came south to count the living and the lost wrote that the place was notorious for disturbances of a supernatural order. What they meant was that fear lingered here, attached to a name people half remembered and half avoided. Chainbreaker. The same name had appeared in letters from soldiers, in court depositions, even in sermons. Each version changed her size, her color, her motive, but none could erase the core truth. Once, on this land, a woman had refused to be less than herself, and men had not known what to do with that refusal. Captain Elias Ransom, a clerk from Massachusetts assigned to Tallapoosa County, made his notes carefully. Locals attribute former unrest to woman of great stature known as Hester, he wrote. No evidence of violence found, considerable evidence of reverence. He underlined that last word twice. Then he closed the folder and ordered that the well be covered with a wooden lid for safety. But you cannot bury sound. Before long, the freed families farming the bottomland began using the well again, drawing water that tasted of mineral and myth. They said the bucket rose lighter in their hands, as if the water wanted to leave the dark. By 1870, the settlement had built a small church on the rise above the field. They named it New Bethel, but in their songs it was called the Chainbreaker Church. The preacher, Reverend Jonah Kittrell, used to say that the name was not about iron, but about habit. Chains are what you stop believing in, he told them. Then they fall. Reverend Kittrell had never met Hester, but his sermons built a life for her. He said she'd once lifted a beam to free trapped children during a storm. He said she'd walked into a burning barn to save a mule because the mule didn't understand human cruelty. He said the sound in the well was her heartbeat, keeping time for the living. Every generation added a line, and each line brought her closer to sainthood. The official record, however, remained thin. The Freedmen's Bureau closed its Alabama offices in 1872, leaving behind boxes of reports that few Northerners ever read. In one of them, a folder labeled Incidents of Note, a single sentence survives. Local colored woman called Chainbreaker, believed to have assisted in maintaining order after collapse of Washburn Estate, highly respected by freed population. That line, once discovered a century later, would become a historian's treasure. But for the people living there, no proof was needed. They lived under her story, the way others lived under roofs. By 1888, a school stood beside the church. Its first teacher, Clara May, kept a slate at the front of the room with a drawing of 9 links. One for each virtue she said Hester taught by example: patience, strength, mercy, silence, courage, work, dignity, truth, and freedom. When children misbehaved, she tapped the slate and said, "Which link did you drop today?" The students would whisper back the right one, and the classroom would fall still again. When visitors passed through the county, they always asked the same question: did she really kill those men? The older residents shook their heads. "No," they said. "They killed their own peace." It was an answer that satisfied no one and silenced everyone. The legend spread outward like the ripples of a thrown stone. In Montgomery, newspapers printed serialized accounts of a giant woman who broke slave chains with her bare hands. In New Orleans, a pamphlet by an abolitionist-turned-publisher retold the story as a parable of divine justice. Each retelling distorted her, but each preserved something essential: that the measure of strength was not in destruction, but in the refusal to yield. At the turn of the century, a traveling journalist named Samuel Harper, the same man who would later chronicle Letty of Lowndes, visited Tallapoosa County in search of the chain-breaker's grave. He found none. What he found instead was continuity. "Her name," he wrote in the Harper's Ledger, "is not inscribed in stone, because stone wears down. It lives in throats." His article quoted an elderly man who had been a child on the Washburn place. "When she walked, we knew the ground under her got its courage back." By the 1920s, the chain-breaker legend had traveled far beyond Alabama. Blues musicians along the Mississippi played songs that used her name as metaphor for freedom. Folklorists from Tuskegee recorded a version where she carried her chains to the courthouse and laid them on the judge's desk. In that version, she didn't kill anyone either. She simply looked at the judge until he forgot the laws he came to enforce. When the Great Migration began, families carried her memory north with their suitcases. In Chicago's South Side churches, murals showed a tall woman lifting broken shackles toward heaven. In Detroit, factory workers hung small iron links on their locker doors as good luck charms. Few of them knew the exact details, but they knew what the story meant: that somewhere in Alabama, a woman once turned the tools of captivity into a symbol of refusal. Back home, the well still stood. Each Easter, the congregation of New Bethel tied a new length of chain around its post, not to bind it, but to remember what could be unbound. And each year, the links rusted quietly into the same color as the red clay around them. When the civil rights era arrived, protesters marching through Montgomery carried signs that read, "Break the chain." One of them, a young activist named Isaiah Brooks, told a reporter, "My grandmother used to say the chain breaker didn't fight with weapons. She fought with standing up straight." He said it into a microphone, and the words went national. By the time scholars reopened the Bureau archives in the 1980s, the legend had outgrown paperwork. Historian Dr. Rachel McCord, while researching Letty of Lowndes, found Hester's brief description of unusual strength. That was all. Yet when she traced the story forward through oral histories, the same pattern emerged: silence mistaken for submission, endurance mistaken for myth, truth hiding in plain view. McCord wrote, "In every county scarred by slavery, there was a woman who carried more than her share and spoke less than her due. Hester, called Chainbreaker, became the vessel for all of them." Today, near the old Washburn site, the state marker still stands. It reads, "Hester Chainbreaker, c. 1830-1868. Her strength could not be measured. Her silence could not be silenced. Visitors still walk down to the well, They say if you drop a pebble and listen closely, you'll hear two sounds: the splash, and then, faint but distinct, the clink of metal on metal echoing back from the dark. Before you go, subscribe to History in Chains. These are the stories that refused erasure, where myth and record meet, and memory decides which one lasts longer. What do you think she left in that well? Anger, forgiveness, or both? Leave your answer below. Montgomery, Alabama, March 1873. In a storage room behind the courthouse, clerks stacked boxes of unused forms beside older boxes, labeled Freedmen's Bureau. Closed files. Most of the papers had yellowed into silence, but a few names kept resurfacing when reporters needed symbols. Hester the Chain Breaker was one of them. The legislature had begun arguing over a monument to faithful slaves. Editors wanted a counterstory, something that smelled of dignity, not obedience. So they borrowed hers. The Montgomery Ledger ran a column titled The Amazon of Tallapoosa. It painted her as half myth, half warning, a female Goliath who bested her tormentors and vanished. Readers debated whether she was real. Letters poured in, some from white landowners calling it superstition, others from newly freed readers insisting they had seen the well, the chain, the woman herself. The editor, sensing circulation, printed both sides. The truth survived by accident of argument. That same spring, a teacher named Clara Baines, later known for her essay on Letty of Lowndes, visited the county to open a freedmen's school. She described meeting a woman who claimed to be Hester's niece. The niece told her, "Aunt Hez didn't break chains. She bent 'em. You bend a thing, it remembers you." Baines wrote those words in her diary. A century later, historians would quote them as poetry. When Reconstruction collapsed and the state withdrew its promise of protection, the legend of the chain breaker shifted again. She became a secret shared at kitchen tables, invoked when danger knocked too loudly. Parents told their daughters, "Stand tall like Hester." No one needed to explain who that was. The name was shorthand for defiance measured in breath, not battle. By the 1890s, a church elder named Jonah Kittrell, Jr., son of the preacher who built New Bethel, began leading an annual service at the well. He called it the uncoiling. Families brought small rusted lengths of chain to lay at the water's edge. After the hymn, the elders would lift one link each and drop it in the bucket, so the sound rang 9 times. 9, they said, for every virtue the old schoolhouse kept on its slate. Children stood still to hear the echo come back. It always did. In 1904, the Atlanta Constitution sent a photographer to capture the ceremony. He took 3 plates, all of which came out blurred. The caption he ran anyway read, "Negroes worship chain idol." It missed everything but the fear behind its own words. Still, those blurred images became the first photographs of the site. They would resurface 70 years later in a documentary that finally listened instead of labeling. During the Great Migration, the chain breaker left Alabama again, this time in the mouths of travelers. In Chicago, a Pullman porter named Eli Cross carried a pocket chain made of twisted wire. When other men asked its meaning, he'd grin, "Insurance, from Tallapoosa." In Detroit's foundries, workers welded tiny links onto lunch pail handles. The story mutated. Sometimes she was a washerwoman, sometimes a soldier's widow. But the refrain stayed. She refused the iron meant for her. Folklorists from Fisk University recorded versions between 1933 and 1938. One singer in Memphis called her Mama Iron. Another insisted she walked out of the river, carrying thunder on her shoulders. Both swore their grandmothers had seen her. When asked how she died, they answered together, "She didn't." Back in Alabama, the Depression brought government writers to gather local color. One, Ellen Ray, visited New Bethel Church in 1936 and noted, "Congregants regard well site as holy, chains used ceremonially, belief not destructive but protective." She wanted to file it under folklore, Negro superstitions. Her field supervisor crossed that out and wrote community traditions. A small correction, but a quiet victory. In 1944, a photograph in the Chicago Defender showed black soldiers boarding a troop train. On one man's wrist, half hidden by his glove, a loop of chain gleamed. The caption, "Carrying History into Battle." After the war, returning veterans brought those loops home, hanging them on church doors as thank offerings. The well filled with them until the waterline rose. When elders worried the weight might break the rope, someone said, "Let it. That's what ropes are for." The civil rights movement transformed the legend from memory into manifesto. In 1955, Montgomery College students staged a silent march called the Chainbreaker Walk. They carried no signs, only lengths of paper chain they tore one by one at the courthouse steps. Newsreels caught the image. Commentators asked who the tall woman was supposed to be. Local organizers smiled and said, "History." When Dr. King visited nearby Selma a decade later, he referenced her indirectly. "There was a woman in Alabama who showed us that iron rusts, but courage does not." The crowd knew exactly whom he meant. Montgomery, 1987. Historian Rachel McCord, while compiling oral histories for a project on post-emancipation folklore, found a scrap of ledger paper labeled Hester, very tall, of unusual strength. She drove to Tallapoosa to see if the well still stood. It did. 9 lengths of chain circled its post, their rust patterned like fingerprints. The church behind it had been rebuilt in brick. Its cornerstone read, "New Bethel, founded 1870, rededicated 1965, still standing." Reverend Isaiah Brooks, son of a marcher and grandson of Mercy Brown, met her there. He said the church kept 2 kinds of records, one on paper, one in song. He handed her a cassette labeled Testimony Night, 1979. On it, a woman's voice trembled through static. "When they tell you we made up the Chainbreaker, tell them we just remembered her sooner." McCord's article, "The Chainbreaker Revisited," appeared in the Journal of Southern Memory in 1989. She concluded, "Whether one woman or many, the Chainbreaker represents the unrecorded labor of those who carried a nation's conscience in their arms." PBS adapted it the next year into a documentary. Viewers wrote letters calling her "our Southern Joan of Arc." McCord replied to one, "She needed no sword, her weapon was presence." In 1996, Alabama erected an official historical marker at the site, Hester Chainbreaker, c. 1830, 1868, born enslaved, remembered for unyielding strength and quiet defiance. Her legend endures as testimony to the will of the unrecorded. Each April, pilgrims gather for the uncoiling service. They drop 9 links into the well and let the sound travel. No one claims to hear words, only resonance, low, metallic, and kind. Today, school books mention her beside Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. Artists paint her tall and calm, eyes closed, palms open. In music, poets rhyme her name with freedom. In classrooms, teachers say, "Some chains break loud, some simply fall apart when no one believes in them anymore." If you stand by the well at dusk, you can see your reflection ripple beside rusted links that never sink. The water moves as if remembering. And if the wind is right, you might hear the faint rhythm of metal touching metal, the quiet applause of history keeping time. So what did Hester leave behind? Not vengeance, not fear, A lesson that power built on cruelty collapses under the weight of endurance. That silence, rightly held, becomes thunder when repeated across generations. That every woman forced to carry more than her share adds one more link to a chain the world cannot lift. Before you leave this investigation, take a moment. Subscribe to History in Chains. Share this story and keep her legend breathing. Tell us in the comments, what do you think the sound in that well really is? A ghost, a heartbeat, or the echo of freedom finally returning home? Because sometimes history doesn't shout its victories. Sometimes it rings.